My shame was so deep, the idea of forgiving myself was just impossible. I felt if I did that, it would not honor the depth of my wrongdoing. On December 18th, 1979, I just got back from college, and a friend and I went to a local high school basketball game. And we met some other friends at a city park, and we all got in the car, all 7 of us, and we drove to a 7-Eleven store. And on the way there, I noticed there was too many people in the front seat, so I asked if the 2 girls would move to the back, which they did, and unknowingly, that would become a fatal mistake. After leaving the 7-Eleven store, we drove back to the park down a twisting waterfront roadway. And one of the gentlemen in the front told a joke, and we were all laughing. And I can remember wiping a tear from my eye, and suddenly my life changed. Only 2 feet from the road, there was an oak tree. I don't even remember it, but I hit it. The first thing I can remember is Mike's soft voice saying, "Can you get out?" And I had broken my arm in half, and I somehow struggled to get out of the front of the door. And then all I could remember is lying straight flat on the ground, looking into the stars, and then sooner or later hearing car doors slam open and shut, and the ambulances and the lights, all the stirring around from something terribly gone wrong. One of the girls in the back seat, Tina, after the collision, was asked by one of the guys, "Are you okay?" And she says, "Yes, I just need to lay my head down," which she did. At the same time, she went into coma. Later, the ambulance took me and all the other injured into the hospital, and I can still remember going into the ER, hearing helicopter blades in the background. And I later learned that that was Tina being transported to another hospital in Pensacola. Because I was in ICU, the doctor didn't want me to know of her condition. Each day in the hospital, I was kept asking the doctor and the staff how she was doing, and all I was told that she's doing fine and no, there's no change. And I kept praying and praying that she'd be okay. And I believe her funeral had already taken place before I had even knowledge of her death. But the doctor just came into my room and simply said she didn't make it, and I'm sorry, and then left the room. Well, the first thing I thought was, this can't be true. I must be in a nightmare. Somebody needs to wake me up. This cannot happen. And each moment I talked about it, and the nurses told me that she actually died on a Tuesday, I finally pieced it together that it was actually Christmas Day. And I just felt crushed. I mean, what was happening? What kind of a nightmare would this happen on Christmas Day? And how would that family respond to this? And now, how would they respond to me? So I was worried sick. I was grief-stricken. I was guilty. I had all these mixed emotions. Physically, I wasn't there yet. And I was just completely lost. A couple of days later, the chief of police, who actually coached me in Little League, came in and said he had to charge me because of the seriousness of the accident, the results, ending in a death. Therefore, they were going to charge me with careless driving. And in those days, it was a $35 fine. And in a sense, it made me feel worse. It made me feel like a human life was only worth $35. Yet easily over the next several years, I would pay a much deeper price than a mere $35. The day I finally was released from the hospital, the first phone call I made was to Tina's house. Tina's father had been killed 3 years earlier in another car wreck. So accompanied with my parents, we drove over to her house, only about a mile away from my house. So the only thing I could talk to her or say to her is to please forgive me. And it sounded so inadequate, it sounded lame. I'm sorry. How does that justify a death? But immediately she walked across the room and hugged me and was able to forgive me. And I'll never forget that this woman, the hell she had gone through, this woman was comforting me. And it just in a sense made me feel even more guilty. I felt in a very immature way that counseling was for weak people. It was a crutch, that I could handle this on my own, and I refused to get any kind of professional help whatsoever. So I was just going through the motions in the summer and even that fall. And then when I came home for Thanksgiving, I learned more tragic news in that Tina's mother's 15-year-old daughter had also just been killed in a car wreck. And even though I was only responsible for one of the 3 deaths, I felt a totality involving all 3. In the back of my mind, I was telling myself, I'll never recover from this event. I would never come to terms and would never have inner peace in dealing with this tragic event. On that same Thanksgiving weekend, I run up into another fender bender and saw a man. And he was bleeding, and for some reason, he represented Christ to me. And I took a beeline to my associate pastor's house and wanted to be a Christian. I wanted to be forgiven by God. And that Sunday of that Thanksgiving, I was forgiven. But I had misunderstood my decision because of my immaturity and naivety in the Christian walk. I realized later being saved had nothing to do with our emotional maturity or emotional healing. Can we be saved and instantly healed? Absolutely. But many times it may take weeks, months, and yet even years. So religion for me had just become another letdown. And because of that, I felt now more because of my alcoholic background. My father had been a alcoholic all of his life, and I'd grown up in that, not as an excuse. I chose to drink because I chose to. But because of that background and my refuse to talk to anybody, and then the religion had turned me down, I felt like I was entitled to drink. And that's how I coped in a dysfunctional way. And alcoholism, in a sense, works. It dulls our emotional pain, but it also dulls our passion for God. But it's also a key avoidance behavior. And I learned the hard way that God won't heal what we continue to avoid. And then I started to feel suicidal for the first time in my life because I'd felt I had tried everything else. So I voluntarily checked myself in to a local hospital at home to be treated for clinical depression. I could not shake this. I could not shake it. And this time I was put in another hospital, a local Air Force Base hospital closer to home. In those 2 hospitalizations, one, they recommended shock treatments. After the shock treatments, I was still suicidal, and I decided I was going to die. I don't know how many people can understand this, but when something like this happens, a tragic event, and someone dies, for me, it was my every single thought, 24/7, for as long as I can remember, in trying to cope with this more than just mere guilt and shame. I had convinced myself the only way to end my emotional pain was to end my life. So I got some pills and I drove to that tree. That tree was my guilt. And I drove to that and swallowed pills and miraculously was saved by a police officer who just, quote, happened to be driving by. And then he thwarted my suicide attempt by, I believe, calling an ambulance, and I was taken to the hospital again. The psychiatrist recommended me going to the state hospital, Florida State Hospital in Chattahoochee, Florida, where I would spend the next 5 months of my life desperately trying to get my act together. I assumed my sin, my mistake, was darker, blacker, uglier than God's ability to forgive it. I was completely wrong. Once I earned privileges on the grounds, I was able to walk the grounds, and I walked into the chapel. And I simply began to read in their library. I remember listening to music, Christian music, for virtually the first time in my life. And that became a daily regiment for me for the next days, weeks, and even months to come. And God was speaking to me through those books, through the music, through prayer, and through silence. In refusing to forgive myself, unknowingly I was playing God and didn't even realize it. And that's when it hit me. I needed to stop playing God. And at that moment, I stood up and walked across the hall and then stumbled into the altar of that chapel. And that was the first time. I was saved before, but that was the first time I literally became a Christian, because I was giving Him all of my heart and all of my hurt. 100%, I'm all out for God now. I began to cry, and more cry. Uncontrollable weeping. Instead of tears of sadness, it was tears of indescribable joy that God had finally saved my soul. This is the first time in my life I had felt inner peace. This is the first time that I can now claim victory. And I could rise and stand like a man forgiven by his Father. I would be in the hospital for another 3 months, and now I had realized that through forgiveness, there was a so-called ceasefire within me, bringing about that inner peace. But now the question became, what is God's redemptive purpose in this tragedy? I do know we are healed by His wounds, and God has healed mine in order to help me empathize with other people that are hurting and they're in need. And therefore, I pursued the career of a licensed therapist, helping hurting people. I can empathize because where I've been, and because of those wounds, able to identify with people, able to lead people, able to just be with people who are hurting and who need to hear the gospel, who they need to hear, they need to see, they need to feel, they need to taste forgiveness and grace. I think now, because of God's calling, I'm a vehicle for that redemption for that person, to return a regret into a restoration. But even with forgiveness, life doesn't go zippy-doo-dah. Even with forgiveness, you got voids, and there's still a void there. She's still dead. So forgiveness makes life manageable, but it doesn't bring people back to life, those kind of things. So it can still be a struggle from time to time. Christmas Day. And I do wish people had more compassion, in a sense, for drivers of fatalities. Mine wasn't a drunk driving case, but those drunk drivers are people too, and they need forgiveness. I do know the Bible often tells us that often when bad things happen, Satan means it for evil. And that night when I hit that tree, I know Satan meant that for evil. But God Himself meant it for good. And through forgiveness and grace, that has become a good. It defines me in a good way. It defines who I am. But good will always overcome evil when we are with God. But we have to have God, and we have to have forgiveness and we must have grace for good to triumph over evil.